Please give a rousing, bold welcome to Dr. Thomas+E+Woods+Jr.
First are Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. We hear a lot about them. Now, Fannie and Freddie, to make a long story short, and I talk about them in the book, but to make a long story short for our purposes, we'll just say Fannie started in the latter half of the 1930s as expressly a government agency. And then several decades later, it was ostensibly privatized. Freddie Mac, conversely, began in 1970 as a putatively private organization. And these organizations are involved in the secondary mortgage market, or they have been for a number of years, so that when your bank, in effect, extends to you a mortgage loan, the bank will often not keep that loan on its books, as you know, and can sell that, including the right to all the future monthly mortgage payments, to institutions like Fannie and Freddie. Well, if Fannie and Freddie really were purely private organizations, they were very odd examples of private organizations. Number one, they enjoyed tax and regulatory breaks that other mortgage guarantors did not enjoy. There are a variety of special privileges government granted that they enjoyed, in addition to the line of credit that they got from the U.S. Treasury that was always available. But beyond that, everybody knew, everybody who wasn't a total blockhead knew that if it should come to that, Fannie and Freddie would be bailed out by the taxpayers. Everybody knew that. And in fact, it turns out everybody was right. That's in fact what happened. So obviously there is an artificial stimulus to risk in that scenario. You can keep all the big profits, but don't worry, if it goes too sour, the suckers will all eat the losses. And so people have argued that these special government privileges that these strange, weird, hybrid, public-private organizations enjoy allowed them to attract more capital into the housing market than would otherwise have been possible on a genuine free market. Secondly, people talk about something called the Community Reinvestment Act, which is a Carter-era piece of legislation, but that really only got enforcement teeth from a regulatory point of view in the mid-1990s or so under Bill Clinton. The purpose of this legislation was to target what was alleged to be discrimination in mortgage lending, in lending by banks. And so the argument was that in order to exonerate yourself, in effect, to protect yourself against possible lawsuits alleging discrimination, you as a financial institution basically should be extending loans not just in the outlying areas of a city, just on the periphery, but really in the community itself. And if you are not extending loans according to some percentage that a government agency will determine, then in effect the presumption is that you're guilty of discrimination. And it becomes difficult in court to prove that you're not guilty of discrimination. Because what are you going to do, put a Svengali on the stand? How are you going to prove that you didn't intend to discriminate, that it just happened to turn out this way? Well, in fact, it's impossible to do that. And so what in fact happened was the banks began to engage in effect, affirmative action in lending. And that's not a controversial statement, because people who supported the Community Reinvestment Act called it that. They expressly said, this is affirmative action in lending. In fact, when AccuBank was taken to court for discrimination and was found guilty, it was saddled with a punishment of $2.1 billion that had to be allocated to inner-city mortgage loans. And the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development at that time, Andrew Cuomo, actually said that, yeah, I'm sure that the mortgage loans they extend under this penalty will be riskier, there will be higher default rates than will other mortgages in the bank's portfolio. So again, it's not like this is some crazy theory that Rush Limbaugh thought. People at the time said this. They said, yeah, sure, this will happen. Absolutely this will happen. But, that's the punishment. What I want to suggest to you, though, is that if these factors aren't altogether red herrings, they are nevertheless grossly overstated in their importance. I want to suggest there's another institution that deserves our attention, and that's an institution that most of us are taught really to ignore. then don't worry, your betters are in charge. You don't even need to be knowledgeable about this. In fact, it's probably better that you not really know anything about it. And that's the Federal Reserve System. Now, most people hear Federal Reserve System, their eyes glaze over and they think, I have no idea what this thing is. I'm never going to understand how it works. This is too complicated. I better just let the experts deal with this. Well, there's your mistake. The so-called experts have no freaking idea what they're doing. And I don't care if you're on the left or the right. That should be obvious. Now, I'll have more to say about particular chairman of the Federal Reserve System as time goes on tonight. But let me say a little bit, though, about Alan Greenspan, who bears great responsibility for the current crisis. And yet here's Greenspan, who just a few months ago gave this inane speech in which he said, you know, I guess there's a flaw in the free market that I never noticed before. You know, I wonder what that, how could I not have seen this flaw? Yeah, Alan, I'll help you find the flaw. Why don't you look in the mirror? Maybe it'll be looking right back at you. There's the flaw. Let me quote to you from Anthony Mueller, economist, who says, since Alan Greenspan took office, late 1980s, financial markets in the U.S. have operated under a quasi-official charter which says that the central bank will protect its major actors from the risk of bankruptcy. Consequently, the reasoning emerged that when you succeed, you will earn high profits and market share, and if you should fail, the authorities will save you anyway. The Financial Times newspaper described the Greenspan put as the view that when markets unravel, count on the Federal Reserve and its chairman, Alan Greenspan, eventually to come to the rescue. And in the wake of the dot-com boom and bust, the Times likewise said that Greenspan was injecting into the economy a destructive tendency toward excessively risky investment, supported by hopes that the Fed will help if things go bad. Now, what was Alan talking about? About a flaw and difficulty in assessing risk? His own institution, the Federal Reserve System, institutionalizes moral hazard because it creates money out of thin air. It has a very cozy relationship with all major Wall Street actors. So when those Wall Street actors go bust, they then go to the paper money producer and ask for a bailout. Why should this be surprising? Why should anybody on earth not have seen that coming? Now, it's been said in criticism of my argument tonight that after all, we did have booms and busts in American history before there was a Federal Reserve System, so how can you pin the blame for those things on the Fed? Well, of course I can't, and I will grant you, in 1819 there was nothing called the Federal Reserve System, so that trivial point I concede. But the substantive point is unchanged, because if you look at the major panics in American history, they all have the same cause. There's no Fed, there's no Alan Greenspan, but they have the same cause. There's either a United States government chartered national bank creating money out of thin air, creating phony baloney booms that are based on sand and that eventually dissolve, or it is private or putatively private banks doing things they'd never be allowed to get away with in the free market, like numerous times throughout the 19th century, when banks would make absurd loans. I mean, ridiculous. During the War of 1812, the New England banks were by and large against the War of 1812, so it was hard for the government to borrow. So a lot of banks in the rest of the country just started up. They had no money in them, and they just started lending. They don't have any actual money, but they're lending anyway. Well, that's the crazy world of banking, that that's possible. But the point is that when that went bust, these banks were told by the federal government, don't worry, you don't have to pay back your depositors. You have 2 years to do it. Well, gee, if I had 2 years, well, who wouldn't make crazy investments? Who wouldn't be lending out money like mad? I mean, just think of the incentive structure that's created, for heaven's sake. Well, let me quote for you from a contemporary who lived through the Panic of 1837. Now, incidentally, you'll notice panics in American history. 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, 1907, then no panics. The government has made our economy panic-proof by just not using the word panic anymore. Now we use the word depression. They don't want to use that word either. So now it's recession. So, I mean, I don't know what the next term will be. Sunshine and lollipops or something. I don't know.